Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm your dean. I'm super excited about tonight's event. And I think that first, before we launch into it, we have to acknowledge that building with care means caring for history, for context, for place. And so I think it's important for us all to remember that we sit on the land of the Massachusetts people, the traditional and ancestral land of the original inhabitants of what we now know as Boston and Cambridge. So it's important to take a moment to pay respect to the people past, present, and future who are of this, for whom the land remains sacred, and which we honor, recognizing that this demands that we ask, what are our obligations to the land and the many people who have been its stewards and its occupants? And I think that's part of what we do here every day, is sort of be conscious of the histories and complexities that really are at the base of any place that we're talking about. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for our virtual and in-person audience. Those joining virtually can enable captions by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the live stream window. For our in-person audience, live captioning is available through the QR code on that screen. So please visit Matt in the AV booth if you have any questions. I also want to invite you to join us for a few upcoming GSD public programs. On Thursday, September 26th, please join us for a lecture by Signe Nielsen, who's a landscape architect and former president of the Public Design Commission. She'll discuss strategies to address controversial monuments in search of a deeper understanding of history. So very much in line with what we're talking about. And then the next day, on September 27th, our own DDES, or Doctor of Design program, will host a day-long conference called Real-Time Nature, with no spacing between those three words. It's a very tight conference, no space even between words. This conference will focus on the promises and perils of environmental simulation, remote sensing, and real-time synchronizations. To learn more about that program or any of our programs, upcoming programs, please see the lineup on the GSD's website. Just go to the events tab. So Malkit Shoshan, who is the convener of tonight's event, is the 2024 Senior Loeb Fellow at Harvard's GSD. So normally this position of a Senior Loeb Fellow is reserved for prominent figures in the field outside the school. Malkit is prominent, but she's inside the school. So as Senior Loebs, these figures typically have come in for a week or so of intensive engagement with the school, including a public lecture, discussions with students, and the like. The dean selects the Senior Loeb in consultation with the Loeb Fellowship curator, John Peterson. And while it might come as a surprise that our choice for this 2024 calendar year was one of our own, design critic in urban planning and design, Malkit Shoshan, selecting her was really a no-brainer for this position. Malkit, who's the founder and director of the architectural think tank FAST, Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory, is uniquely positioned to address the theme of this year-long Loeb role, which is design in conflict. I wish I could say that that's an easy topic. But honestly, despite the number of conversations and workshops that Malkit has organized around this topic, we'll just be dipping our toes into one of the most timely, urgent, and relevant topics that we all face as designers, policymakers, researchers, and faculty. I'm very grateful to Malkit for taking this on, this important and challenging role, which also enables all of us at the GSD and those of you in our greater audience here in Piper and by Zoom to benefit from what her students have long admired, her experience, her expertise, and her own care for teaching and for the topics that she engages. In case you missed it, I encourage everyone here to stream her first lecture in this Senior Loeb role, which took place on February 27th and is accessible on the school's website. Just wait till this event is done to stream it. Don't do it now. In 2021, Malkit was awarded the Silver Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennale for her collaborative project, Border Ecologies and the Gaza Strip, watermelon, sardines, crabs, sand, and sediment, which is also the subject of her forthcoming book, which is being done in collaboration with Amir Kideh, and is being published by Mac Books this year, right? Give or take. Her previous award-winning books on spatial equity, peace, and conflict include Blue, The Architecture of UN Peacekeeping Missions, Atlas of Conflict, Israel-Palestine, and Village, One Land, Two Systems, and Platform Paradise, among others. Malkit is teaching a seminar this fall on interdisciplinary art and design practices centering on the topic of care. We'll learn more about what that means in this evening's program. I want to thank and welcome Malkit to the podium. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much, Dean Whiting, for the kind introduction, extensive introduction, and for providing with the space and resources to discuss the intersection of design and conflict under the auspice of the Senior Loeb Fellowship. And thank you, everyone, here for joining us this evening, and in person and online. So, building with care, feminist perspectives on design in conflict marks our fourth public event and fifth conversation. The first event took place in January 2023, right after the winter break, during which a series of events left us all feeling distressed and disoriented. We have been witnessing remotely very violent war and mass killing unfolding that, along with many others, has affected us here at the school and the university. While the first event aimed to provide a space, or to start holding a space for addressing our personal and collective anxiety, we have created a series of additional meetings like this one to explore diverse perspectives and themes extrapolating from the overall topic of designing within conflict. So this semester, we will hold several lectures and conversations in collaboration with the GSD Public Program, with the Loeb Fellowship, with the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative at the Divinity School, with Harvard Art Lab, and with MDes Publics. Tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., we will host a follow-up workshop to this event at the Divinity School in James Room. You can follow all the events scheduled for this semester via the GSD Now. Today we will have 3 short presentations by Tatiana Bilbao, Elke Krasny, and myself. We were considering to call each other in the first name only from now on, so no last names. And we will be followed by a conversation with Carolina and Lina. About a year ago, Elke reached out to Tatiana and me to discuss the meaning of peace in our practices, and that evolved into a series of conversations, meetings that we held on Zoom. About how can we reclaim design and architecture to imagine a world at peace. And this is just very shortly a very short summary of our very long conversations. And this event is actually a result of those meetings, and it's the first time that we make these private conversations public. Too often our relationships with each other and the world are framed through the lens of war. In addition to the over 120 militarized conflict globally, we use the word war to describe collective efforts for societal and cultural change, such as war on poverty, war on obesity, war on crime, war on climate change, and war on women. With this event, we ask ourselves, and you, what if we replace the word war with the word care? And how can we prioritize care as a pragmatic process daily and alongside an ethos of collective well-being? Over the next hour and a half, we will discuss those issues, linking them to feminist perspectives. Our presentations are different and complementary, and each of us will present about 10 minutes, a little bit more. I will start, and I will be followed by Tatiana and then Elke, and we will conclude with a conversation with two former EMDA students and current DDES candidates here at the GSD, Carolina and Lina. So my title for this section of the presentation is Taking Notes. As I go through my personal archive of images to reflect on the topic of this event, my notes are both abstract and personal, stemming from experiences in conflict-affected spaces. These include growing up in a country where war was ever present and studying architecture in institutions complicit in colonialist projects and violence. My work involves navigating these contested and dehumanizing spaces, making them visible and exploring how we can contribute to change that centers social and environmental justice through design. So I won't read all the captions of my notes. I will start with the first notes, and I'll read that inner cover. I often return to the atlas of the conflict Israel-Palestine as my personal compass, which has changed how I practice, consider, and reclaim architectural tools to better understand and engage with my environment and with space. It is where I began developing my own art of noticing, as extensively written about by Anna Singh. And while the book cover features the fluctuation of political borders, the relations between nations and territory, the inner cover displays a gallery of leaders, generals, negotiators, and representatives who have influenced the region's politics, governance, and territory. The gender dimension is clear. Women have been systemically excluded from decision-making processes around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Globally, women and girls are disproportionately affected by war and militarized conflict, often targeted for violence, including rape, murder, sexual slavery, forced pregnancy, and forced sterilization. During and after conflict, women consistently proven to be essential to conflict prevention and post-conflict reconciliation, yet their voices are often overlooked both individually and systemically. For example, as of January 1st, 2024, only 18 countries have a woman as a head of state, and only 16% of the participants in peace processes are women. So excluding women from decision-making not only undermines peace effort, but it perpetuates violence and instability, not only in this global context, but also within our respective, let's say, institutions and environments. So my second note, removing bombs, sowing seeds. I took this photo in 2016 at a UN super camp in Gao, northern Mali, or the contested territory of Azawad. UN super camps are usually stretched over a vast territory, often replacing former grazing land and fields which were part of a vital ecosystem supporting local life. As I walked through the camp, I noticed that some parts were still under construction, while others were occupied by UN agencies and different troops. Before a UN base is occupied, UN protocols require that the area will be first sterilized. That means clearing the ground, the trees, huts, vegetation, rocks, which is often covered with, and then they often cover it with a thin layer of gravel, creating a sort of a barrier between the local soil and the international presence. In Mali, like in many other missions, peacekeeping also involves clearing improvised explosives, devices, and mines, which cause about 15,000 deaths each year. As I toured the base in Gao, I barely noticed one peacekeeper originally deployed to disarm landmines, quietly tending to a small herb and vegetable garden. She was seated so close to the ground that I almost missed her. This garden in the desert looked out of place amid the rigid modular infrastructure and engineered sterility of the base. A couple of years later, I traveled to Monrovia for field research as the UN was wrapping up its 13 years peacekeeping mission in Liberia. And I took these photos at one of the mission liquidation sites. At the edge of the base, I noticed a large pile of decaying guns and bullet cases in open puddle of chemicals waiting to be dissolved, ensuring that they won't be used again. The UN mission in Liberia set up and deployed bases in 20 cities and rural villages. This mission was launched after 14 years of brutal civil war that devastated countless lives and wrecked the entire country, including homes and infrastructure. And the UN troops were sent in to help keep a fragile peace agreement between the rebels and rebel forces and the local government that was signed in 2003. One of the first tasks for the peacekeepers was to disarm around 40,000 militia members, but right off the bat, they faced some resistance. Many fighters wanted payment for their weapons, which led to violence. In response, the UN decided to offer $75 for each gun as an incentive. So some of the ammunition they collected was left behind as thin metal scraps, making sure it won't be used again. And just for reference, there are about 1.5 billion firearms already in circulation around the world. And every weapon that goes back into circulation raises the chance of violence. My fourth note, wastelanding. So wastelanding refers to environmental and social harm caused by the exploitation of resources. This degradation affects community health, results in cultural displacement, creates systemic inequalities, and often ignores the histories of affected people. In recent years, I have taught here a class in collaboration with the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, focusing on the spatial aspect of nuclear technologies, including uranium mines, power plants, and nuclear testing sites. During our sessions, we hosted repeatedly Valerie Rangal, a Navajo artist and community activist, who discussed the severe cross-generational health effects of uranium mining and nuclear testing on her community. She also highlighted the ongoing neglect, the systemic neglect of their towns and homes. Nuclear infrastructure is an interesting perspective to deploy in order to see clearly, laser-focused, the systemic injustice in our society and render it visible, or render visible the sacrifice zones. The destruction and radiation from nuclear testing, mining, and power plants have affected more than just the Navajo community. Karen Borad, a scholar and quantum scientist, discusses the unequal impacts of nuclear testing on indigenous peoples. She notes that testing sites are never empty. They are taking place on land inhabited. And it's important to recognize in this context that the US alone has dropped about 2,000 atomic bombs on indigenous land. So Timothy Morton refers to nuclear matter as hyperobjects, which are vast and complex entities that stretch across space and time, extending beyond human experience and perception. With nuclear matter, we realize that the consequences of our actions cannot be understood solely through Aldo Leopold's perspective, which linked ecology and ethical action to our senses. What happens when we cease to understand the world, when we no longer perceive the impact of our action through our senses? How can we address ethics regarding violence that remains invisible to us? Especially at a time when, for instance, now global arms controls faces collapse. Invisibility is a space where design can matter. It is not just the nuclear threat that devastates lives and the environment. Thousands of different types of bombs have been dropped on Gaza, more than in any recent conflict, each creating a crater of 12 meters or more. And this contamination is neither localized nor temporary. The soil in Gaza is severely contaminated by munition. The air is thick with unbreathable smoke, and the aquifer is now flooded with toxic matter and seawater. Remediation of soil, air, groundwater, and psyche may go beyond human capacity to measure or perceive or remediate, and perhaps should be considered similar to what Tim Morton defined as goo. And of course, it's not just Gaza being bombed, nor is it only Israel that is dropping bombs. According to CIPRI, global military, and you can see what CIPRI means down in the slide, sorry. Global military spending reached $2.24 trillion in 2022. It continued to rise even during the COVID pandemic. And that raises troubling questions. Why prioritize military growth during a health crisis? And why emphasize militarization over urgent issues like environmental degradation or climate change? Military activities, both in war and in peacetime, harm the environment through pollution and habitat destruction. In addition to the military-heavy fossil fuel use, that contributes to greenhouse gas emission that worsen climate change. So the environmental impact of military operation is often ignored in global carbon accounting, making it difficult to create a clear strategy to combat climate change. As climate change worsens, resource scarcity and tensions, military action fuel conflicts and insecurity, creating a cycle that links closely military action to climate change and conflict. And a question that comes to mind here, what if we would have invested $2.24 trillion in care or in other global tasks like environmental restoration? The amount could restore, for example, about 600 million to 3 billion hectares of degraded land. That is about 5 to 6 times the size of the Amazon rainforest. It's also an amount that might help build 2,500 fully equipped hospitals or 100,000 schools or 20 million houses. I'll move to my next note, Love in a Mist. Just before the pandemic, in 2019, I curated an exhibition here at Drucker Gallery called Love in a Mist, The Politics of Fertility, that examined various evolving narratives surrounding the space and politics of fertility. The exhibition was triggered by the Heartbeat Bill, which then passed into law in states such as Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, to outlaw abortion from as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy. The exhibition was set to explore society's quest to control women and nature and the resulting environmental degradation. It featured 4 themes or chapters, including reproductive rights, accelerated growth, extinction, and compost. These themes were presented within a long wireframe structure that resembled a greenhouse, a space of nurture or control. We made this narrative accessible through multiple artworks, policy reports, policy recommendations, design, and activist interventions. And we also diagrammed, together with Carolina, who is here with us, the impact of synthetic hormones, which are tiny molecules made of about 4 carbon rings, ingested by women as dietary supplement, first recommended by Harvard doctors to prevent miscarriages. These hormones were also administered to farm animals to boost body mass for profit. This mid-century invention transformed food production, leading to human deformities, inflated farmed animals, and increased farm sizes, affecting every aspect of the food supply chain, and it resulted in degraded soil, waterways, and air quality. The final part of the exhibition honored Donna Haraway's Children of Compost fabulation, and it urged us to reimagine relationship between humans, earth, and other living beings amid environmental destruction and social injustice, and it emphasized the need for interdisciplinary collaboration to promote symbiotic living. This section featured work by Yael Bartana, including the recorded performance 2 Minutes to Midnight, and a neon art piece, What If Women Ruled the World? And we didn't know the transition that is taking place in the school at this moment. And the compost installation also showcased Tabitha Rezair video work, Sugar Wall Teardome, which paid tribute to the contribution of Black women womb to modern science, as well as celebrated the healing power of female bodies. The performance was situated next to another sculpture titled Small Womb by Atelier van Lieshout, aimed to remind us of the vital organs of our bodies that get us all going. Van Lieshout also designed another piece that was installed in this exhibition, and it was the mobile treatment room for women on waves, which dealt with, it's actually an initiative that aimed to advocate and support safe reproductive health access for women across the world. The final artwork, okay, great. The final artwork was titled Complex System by Desiree Doloron, and it featured a digital drone flock of starling that scatter across the sky in an ever-changing pattern. It explored themes of fragility, impermanence, and the relationship between the individual and the collective, prompting reflections on humanity and the collective unconscious. In closing, I just want to say briefly one more thing. I want to challenge our acceptance of all these sacrifice zones, which I pulled from my personal archive, whether they are the nuclear test sites or the indigenous land, on the indigenous land, the exploding arm industries, or the ongoing degradation of our planet or our wombs and our bodies. We need to figure out together how can we challenge and resist practices that place power over compassion, which have become deeply embedded in our lives and in our systems. And we need to find ways to learn together how to use our designs to imagine the world otherwise. I think Elke will speak about it later. I'll stop here, and before leaving, I don't have the introduction, or I do have, let me see. Okay, before leaving, I need to introduce my partner here, Tatiana, whom I admire. So thank you so much for joining us today. Tatiana is an architect. We were considering whether to introduce each other, but I think it's good to give a little bit of context. So Tatiana is an architect based in Mexico City. She founded her studio in Mexico in 2004. Prior to this, she worked as an advisor in the Ministry of Development and Housing for the Federal District of Mexico City. And Tatiana holds a recurrent visiting teaching position at Yale University. She taught here at the GSD, she taught at the Columbia University, at GSAP, at Rice University, at Peter Burns School of Art, and at Düsseldorf in Germany, and in other places. And her studio work intersects field research with the construction of an intellectual approach to focus on spaces that aim to become platforms for the possibility and the enhancement of life across typologies and in different parts of the world. She has been awarded many awards and distinctions, including the Kunstpreis Berlin in 2012, the Global Award for Sustainable Architecture by the Locus Foundation in 2014, the Marcus Prize Awards in 2019, the Tau Sigma Delta Gold Medal of ACSA 2020, and so many more. Thank you so much for making the time and joining us in this conversation, and I'm really excited to have this dialogue with you and with Elke again in person. Thank you, Tatiana.
Well, I'm very glad to say that this panel is full of admiration. Thank you, Malkit. It's reciprocal. And thank you for the beautiful introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting us. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I was born with a female sex as birth, and I have identified as women since. I graduated as an architect in 1998 and became a mother of children not grown in my belly in 2007, and a mother to children grown inside my belly in 2011. However, I did not become a mother, a woman, or an architect until someday in 2020. In August 2019, we woke up with chants, screams, and signs of suffering women and family members to the first massive protest for feminicides in Mexico. 10 women are killed every day. 10 women are killed every day in Mexico. The protests started to emerge all over the country, fueled by a massive policies present and a new elected president that, more than addressing the problem, was worried that these protest groups could put a threat to this new declared Republica. To join forces to this national movement, in March 2020, women architects gathered at the Teatro Degollado in Oaxaca to speak on their practices. I could not speak. Hours before living within this political context, I could not only feel anger for what was happening, I could only feel the treason I had been to my gender and my profession. I could only confront the audience by declaring myself guilty. Guilty of having grown in the top of the privilege and not using it to open paths for those who are not there. For having a professional education of such and not using it to open paths for people who have not a professional education of that sort. I was taught to erase spatial discrimination, and I was guilty of not doing it. I was guilty of performing and imprisoning patriarchy, and I was profoundly sad to understand that I was impersonating a woman, and I was not being one, a mother, and I was not being an architect, a mother and an architect with not a profound conscience of being any of those. I understood ever since I graduated, though, that for me, architecture was not an aesthetic act. I knew always the responsibility it took I knew that to be an architect, it needed to be understood as a practice that provides a basic form of care for bodies. Architecture is that. I knew that the domestic environment then was my line of work. I worked in numerous projects to address the so-called social crises, in institutional programs, but mainly a profound interest in affordable ways to achieve the so-called dreams, a house for more. But it was not until I stood up in Oaxaca that I clearly understood what I had been hearing in the room next to mine for years, from people like Pier Vittorio Aureli, Maria Cerezada Giudici on the house, that I understood that the deepest treason that I had ever seen was the house when I saw it with a feminist eye. The house is a pedagogy to establish power and a tool to perpetuate capitalism. Social housing is not a project that challenges capitalism, it's the one that helps perpetuate it. Today, we live in the city of production, where every corner is surrendered to the form in which we exist today. In this city, we live, and we have to produce to live in it. This city decides who and how can inhabit it. It's not for everybody. It's for those who can produce. But the major friction comes when we understand that to produce, we have first to exist. And for this, we need to care. Care is a labor, the labor we need all to have done to exist. The house we have in this city is designed to sustain the city of production. This house does not care. This house produces and reproduces discrimination, oppression, and helps hide the labor that maintains our existence. Well said by Fernanda Canales, the modern house, the origin of the house we live in today and built all over the world, is based on three frictions. The house as a place of rest, as if work would be separated from life and domestic chores would disappear. The house as a private property available to all, as if by considering it a commodity, it would not be determined by the logic of market, making it unaffordable for the majority. And the house as a sanctuary for the nuclear family, husband, wife, and children, as if there were no other formats of coexistence, and the private and the public were two independent fractions. The house, as a human right, is a fundamental place for existence of the human being on the planet. We humans cannot exist without protection, and I dare to call it a mediation over our heads, but that's a subject of another conversation, with the environment that surrounds us. However, the house that has been understood as the one that guarantees the right has foundational problems, but most profoundly is that it responds to a logic of production, consumption, exploitation, discrimination, and not to the one of reproduction. Through mechanisms of compartmentalization, of homogenization, and of adversity to possibility, in short, though, mechanisms even more determined than the ontological characteristic of architecture, determination. If today we live in the city of production, for which we must produce to exist, it seemed urgent to me to imagine then how is the city where we first exist to be able to produce. For me, that's the city of care. And it not only has to be reimagined in a different way, but it must begin at its reimagining the home, which is the architecture that provides a primary form of care, that which sustains the existence of the body, that focuses its core in care, that maintains physical and physiological health, that allow us to develop. Today, that house cannot exist in most of the countries in the planet, not only because we have not imagined it, but also because the laws do not allow it, at least not in my country. Housing is a constitutional right, but not for everyone, only for families. The Constitution determines for whom it is, although the reality is that it's not even for families. But not only that, the right comes when we understand it's only a qualifying none. The law in my country determines how it's a house. it says exactly there how it needs to be conceived. And it says clearly that it's a place of rest, and that the spaces for reproductive care are only auxiliary spaces. Is, of course, a tool for determining who and how can live in it. Hopefully, you are one of those 19% of the population that at some point in your life decides to become an heteropatriarchal family. Very good, because you have most of the space built on earth to you. Be careful, don't grow up and have only 2 children, probably 8 and 10 years old, all your life, preferably of the same sex, because you probably would only have a room. But because your house is designed this way, however, it is your most valuable asset, is the one you would pay your whole life. It is for life, but it doesn't serve you for even a quarter of it. But even worse, the Constitution says that it recognizes that we are a multicultural country. I'm talking always about Mexico, sorry. Thank goodness I do not know any country that is not multicultural. Some are less than others, but I don't think there's almost none with the same culture through its territory. And yet we have failed to recognize profoundly that. The right says that it recognizes that the 67 cultures in Mexico have the right to represent themselves, to develop their own form of coexistence and social organization. Nevertheless, the house described in the law, and the one that it's authorized to be built, be able to receive subsidies and to receive any type of financial help, aid, or credit, is a house that does not recognize that there are 67 cultures. It doesn't allow any other forms of organization, and it doesn't only discriminate the existence of the body, it also discriminates every human being on this planet. We all need an intimate space to nourish the body and rest and other things. But who said that was called a bedroom? And more, that it needed to have a bed. Yes, we use beds, but not all of us use them for sleep. Who also said that we needed to share a bed with someone? Or maybe can we think that there's people not having enough possibilities for having one space directly for that? People do sleep in other ways. There is also the same if we go through every space of the house. There's very few people with the luxury of having one space determined for X activity. But also go more profoundly, when did we forget that probably the bathroom is an incredible place to understand how to care for our bodies and the relationships with the other bodies? And of course, the kitchen is the most controversial one, and that is really, truly a topic for another lecture or 10. But who decided that food was about putting proteins and vitamins in our bodies? Food is about putting nurture to our bodies. Histories, cultures come with it, with flavors, with possibilities of developing different types of food, which in the kitchen we have standardized and placed all over the world is not possible anymore. But most importantly, who said someone had to cook for us? And why one person in a space reduced to an intimate environment? In my country, in the majority of the 67 cultures, food is a collective act. Not only the preparation of it, but also the sharing of those. And not only that, food to nurture and to trespass histories and cultures is not cooked with the appliances that we are providing and seeing everywhere and codified in the regulations. We can say that again of every single space. Who said we needed a space for representation, a place for leisure? That's only for very few in this country. We have proven that the houses need much more than that. And we can extend this towards the topic of the garden, and nevertheless, of the idea of the dream house with the pool. We really think that everybody can have a pool, and that's the dream we're proposing. Who really has the capacity of thinking how anyone else can live. I really understood that we have not only not the capacity, but we don't have the right to think how anyone can live. Therefore, creating platforms for anyone to design their own life seemed urgent to define how I was going to be an architect. We started thinking and challenging codes to be able to open and understand more possibilities for people to live in, but also for other species as well. We have worked in several regards trying to think how to include the possibility of a collective to exist, a collective that it works beyond our own bodies and our own species to collaborate with more. The projects have been taking shape in many regards, no? So thinking on how to include the possibility of everyone to use their own city in their own way. It was the topic of an intervention we did in Columbus, Indiana last year. So by bringing a set of pieces of furniture after having lots of conversations with the community, we decided that the best way is that if we provided a platform for anybody to design their own form of using this public plaza. So what we did is creating shelves for people to filled with things that were kind of drawn by the conversations we had the community, for people to use them in various ways. People invented things that we could even not imagine. But at the end, they were really creating their own possibility of using this public space in their own way. We have been also trying to knit with a purpose of understanding if care is able to be driven at the center of a conversation, but mostly of space. We needed clothes while talking about our mothers, our grandmothers, our ancestors that had helped care for our clothes. But not only that, we also helped forward the conversation on who designs these clothes, who makes them, who washes them. We make these quilts in different workshops all over the world with totally different contexts, and the conversations revolved around same people, our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, and the women who have cared around us. Not a single person didn't have the name of a woman in the forefront of this conversation. I really, through this process, and a hard process of kind of giving birth, but also being rebirth, was that I understood that what it means to care for a body by being the architecture for two human beings inside of me, that then I became a real women architect. And I am because of the people that have been names I know, names that I don't know, and that probably those that I don't know are infinite. But I then understood how to become a woman architect and a mother. Thank you so much. My turn is to present Elke. It is my honor to be sharing this podium with Elke. Thank you, Elke, for putting us together and really caring to provoke a conversation that has enriched profoundly the way I act and I do and I whereabouts. Elke is a professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and she focuses on concerns of care, commemorative practices, translational feminisms, and social and ecological practices in architecture, infrastructure, urbanism, and critical pedagogies of the art. Krasny was a fellow at the CCA, and her curatorial work on hands-on urbanism was shown at the 2012 Venice Biennial for Architecture. Together with Angelika Fritz, she edited Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet. And her book, Living with an Infected Planet, that I truly recommend, was published in 2023, that focuses on militarized care, essentialisms, and feminist recovery plans in pandemic times. Welcome, Elke.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Malkit and Tatiana, because it's an enormous honor to be speaking after you. And I'm also really grateful that there are people like you in the world who insist that the world can be different and that despite of all the pain and the conflicts, there is meaning that can be produced otherwise and differently so that we can coexist in ways that sometimes we lose hope for. Before I go into my presentation, I want to repeat two things that I learned from you. I mean, I learned many things, but one that I found very important is invisibility is a space where design can matter. So all the things that haven't become visible yet, but it's in these spaces where design makes a difference. And the other thing is that Tatiana said architecture is not an aesthetic act, which brings us to see all the things that architecture is also, apart from being aesthetic, which again has something to do with this invisibility. So seeing the things that architecture actually does that are just not aesthetic, even though aesthetics also are important, I would say. So I will share some thoughts and reflections, and I'm supposed to do that now in 5 minutes because we were instructed to finish at 7:30. I'm not quite sure I can do it in 5 minutes, but I'll be fast. So building with care, feminist perspectives on design in conflict. Building with care requires that we learn with care and that we learn from care. So building with care requires to understand that care is knowledge, a way of relating to the world. But it's also, as we all know, labor, ethics, and feelings. So care is a very slippery term. It means many things and it relates to many different fields of existence. At the same time, care has to be understood as environmental, material, infrastructural, and spatial. Care is needed by living and sentient beings, so not just by human beings, but by all living and sentient beings, as well as by the planetary environments they find themselves in. And care is also provided by living and sentient beings and the environments they find themselves in. So if we think about needs and provision, we see that between needs and provision is the territory of conflict, the territory of contradiction, of exhaustion, of exploitation, and also at times the territory of wars. Economic, political, material, infrastructural relations between needs and provisions define the conditions of care. Justice, care, injustice, freedom to care, exploitation of care, access to care, but also care violence. And I want to just list some of the terms that help us understand that care crosses many different scales and levels, and there's more. I mean, so this is just to help us think. Animal care, health care, elder care, medical care, heritage care, monument care, death care, environmental care, infrastructure care, parental care, planetary care, state care. And I ended with state care because this is maybe the most complicated term in this list, how the state in relation to care has also become a perpetrator of violence, discrimination, of the perpetuation of patriarchal injustices in plural. The book that I co-edited together with Angelika Fritz was already mentioned. We titled it Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet, and tried to bring a perspective of care to the field of architecture. So how architecture can be understood as care, as Tatiana already spoke about. Architecture in its broadest sense provides shelter, which is indispensable to the continuation of human life and survival. And this is evidently a form of care. Yet historically, architecture has not been considered a form of caring labor. Despite this fundamental function of architecture to provide protection for humans from sun, wind, snow, or rain, and to give the support necessary for maintaining the vital functions of everyday living, the idea, so I'm talking about the historical idea, the modern Enlightenment idea, when the modern architect was actually formed educationally and invented. Today there are architects who actually are caring architects, but I'm talking about this epistemic mastery that was very much inscribed into the profession, which of course is also a question of power. The idea of the architect is linked to autonomy and independent genius rather than connectedness, dependency, social reproduction, and caregiving. While the idea of the architect being an artist, traditionally gendered male, has been most influential over centuries, and there are many books in architecture histories that still tell us these stories. The notion of the architect being a carer, traditionally gendered female, and considered menial labor performed by racialized others, has been completely absent from the discourse on architecture, historically. The reasons for this are as much political as they are economic. They have to do with the class, sexualized, and racialized division of power and labor that historically excluded spatial practices performed by Black, indigenous people, people of color, women, or workers from the idea of architecture with a capital A, as it was discursively shaped by Western thought. So this is, in a way, I'm kind of jumping to another theme, and I can't build a very elegant bridge, so you just have to jump with me. So during the pandemic, like many other feminist scholars, activists, thinkers, I was very worried about the fact that there was a call to war, that we were fighting a war against the virus, even if there should have been a call to care. And this then made me write this book that Tatiana already mentioned. And on one hand, the book looks at the conditions of the front line of care, the militarized essentialism, that people were turned into caring soldiers or caring warriors that had to deliver essential care as service for their nation state, but I'm also dedicating a chapter to feminist recovery plans. So I'm not asking you to raise your hands if you have heard of feminist recovery plans before, but I imagine that not too many of you have studied them or heard of them, which is very sad indeed, because they're policy documents that actually provide a way forward, a way of centering economies and also ecologies around care. So we are at war, is what we were told in 2020, and this led to what I would characterize as militarized care essentialism. Of course, care is essential, but the way in which it was produced was through a notion of militarization. And militarization seems to guarantee solidarity and duty and moral obligations, which tells us a lot about the ways in which patriarchal history has shaped militarization of the mind. These photographs are just to remind us of pandemic conditions, and also that COVID warriors is really a term that was introduced as, for example, by the Modi government in India, that the volunteer nurses had to perform as COVID warriors, very often without the necessary protection for themselves. And these feminist recovery plans that were written in Hawaii, across the African continent, but also in countries like Ireland or by UN Women, were actually plans that looked at the conditions of life. They do not really speak about architecture, but I think they are useful literature for architecture and designers to read in order to understand what is necessary for thrival. So that's a kind of made-up word. So thriving and turning that into a noun. What really impressed me is that the first such plan that was written in Hawaii by activists, policymakers, and health workers together is that in these documents there are references to feminist theory, but also feminist poetry and literature that kind of makes these policy documents oscillate between the realities of life, the material conditions, but also we could say the intellectual, epistemic, and the ways of thinking. So bringing those two together is maybe not how people like me would think about policy, because I expect policy to be much drier. And here the document in Hawaii was called Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs, and this is of course a reference to the seminal anthology, The Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which was edited by Moraga and Ansaldúa in 1981. In Acts of Healing, placed at the beginning of the volume, The Bridge Called My Back, feminist and queer cultural theorist Gloria Ansaldúa writes, "We carry this bridge inside us, the struggle, the movement toward liberation. No doubt, all of us have found by now that you don't build bridges by storming walls. That only puts people's backs up." And I think this is actually a declaration of peace that we are reading here. The AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective also put forward such a feminist recovery plan, and they argued all the things that we have already heard by the two of you, by Malkit and Tatiana before, that the economic orthodoxy and compulsory neoliberalism is not what will bring peace or care to the world, but that it will continue exploitation, exhaustion, climate ruination, and injustices. And I'm coming towards my last slides. I want to quote Saidiya Hartman that with this very important formulation that care is the antidote to violence, which she stated in a salon in honor of Christina Sharp that was titled In the Wake. And this I just want to show. I don't want to read all these zeros. It's really complicated. But I think if we just look at them and understand another territory of invisibility that was talked about before, the invisibility of the climate catastrophe caused by wars, because it was exempt from the Kyoto Protocol, and the invisibility of care in the GDP, because in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when the mechanism of the GDP was invented in this country, they actually decided to exclude caring labors, because it would have been too much work to actually count all these hours. Building with care requires a feminist demilitarization of the mind, a refusal of the labors of violence and war, resistance against giving up hope, and starting to learn how to think we care, therefore we are. And I would like to conclude with this and ask Carolina, Lina, Tatiana, and Malkit to join me on these chairs here.
Well, I want to start by giving you thanks for the presentations, and especially to Malkit, because she invited me and Lina to be in this position of talking with such an amazing group of women. And I want to start by taking the time to actually acknowledge the privilege we are having now to actually think about care, like what care does it mean in this moment. And second, I want to share some thoughts I have with your presentation. When you invited me, I thought, okay, care. What about care? Everyone is, in a way, talking about care. It's a slippery term, it's sticky, it feels like even a tag. And everyone seems to now be caring about care. So what can I say about care? And I want to start by quoting what you said, Malkit. You said something, what happens when no longer we perceive the impact of our actions through our senses. And I think that's key, because we're talking again about a certain invisibility. And I think this is, of course, in the context of an exploding arms industry. And a second thought that then Elke brings back again about how has the separation between nature and human has been a part of the construction of these power structures and the society's quest to control women and nature. And then I want to go to Tatiana. I feel like you, and I love your work, and I really appreciate your obsession with the house as a unit. And I see it, I have seen how you approach the house from your professional practice, also with the studios you do. And I want to mention something that I was watching when I was doing a bit of research for this, and I watched an interview they did for the NGV Museum, the exhibition. How would it be in English? Lavar la ropa.
La ropa sucia se lava en casa.
Lavar la ropa sucia se lava en casa.
Dirty clothes are aired home while washing.
Yeah. So you were saying, you're talking about your own experience with COVID and how actually the structure of your own place wasn't able to actually create a community of care, of how, like, sharing the cooking activities, the cleaning activities, etc. So it goes to the core of the problem here, like, the structures, the infrastructure we're talking about, it's not adapted to actually a house care. And then I want to mention also going to Elke and how you describe in your work care as a process, as an activity that needs to be done in a continuation, it needs to be done in repetition, and how actually care becomes reparative. So it's a reparation process. And you mentioned Gloria Anzaldúa, a feminist and queer theorist, Gloria Anzaldúa, and her text about the acts of healing, how care becomes an act of healing at the end. And again, that brings the question or the focus to care, what we care about, what we care for, etc. So care as far has been separated from architecture. We have seen architecture progress and then feelings and the rational world going completely in separate tracks. And that talks about how feelings and the rational have been outside the Western canonical model. And there seems that there's no space for the embodied experience, the senses. And I guess my question, this is very abstract and I'm thinking while I speak, but so care is an embodied experience. And second, I will say that care is already a project or a paradigm. And that's my question. I'm not sure if it's the right paradigm, and we can discuss about that. Like, is it the care is a paradigm we have to engage now to change things? I'm not sure, but let's say that it could be a certain kind of new paradigm. A paradigm that was left behind with this, with the Western rational way of seeing things, and how also like the senses were separated from the acts of thinking or planning, designing, etc. And how actually, for example, touch is one of the less important senses and was discarded. For example, the witches were burned because they had a power in their touch. And touch, with the hands, you clean, and you do the care work. So I want to just mention that. But going back to the more critical part of this conversation, and I want to ask you, because I want to know what you think about this, how we actually can practice care, acknowledging the systems of oppression that are behind, and how we can actually create this paradigm in which we don't commodify care, but make it a project.
That is the question.
That was a long response and many things to kind of plow through. Well, I think it's important to care about care, obviously, with all the presentations that we've seen today and the concerns that we raised. I don't think that we have answers. I think all of our imagination, this is what actually led, I think, Elke actually to reach out and initiate this conversation, is kind of almost a cry for help, that how can we demilitarize our imagination, how we can liberate our imagination from systems, both financial system, cultural system, cultural systems that kind of are so embedded in our everyday life and in our action and in our being, that how we liberate ourselves from that and bring back care. I think it's a big question. I don't know. It's something that we put here out in the public, and I think I really like the presentation of Elke, that where you showed this alternative policy paper, policy proposals, these recommendations that try to kind of reimagine the words that we may be able to use in order to expand our vocabulary and the way we engage with the existing system through intervention in policy and bringing poetry to policy. This is really, mind-blowing at this moment, but why shouldn't it be a practice? For me, I kind of still overwhelmed from the level of violence in my environment, and I only try to stay sane while making visible what I am able to see, which is a fraction of what's going on.
There was so much that needs to be responded to. I find it challenging or difficult. So I guess you raised all the concerns why we are here, or why we are struggling, or why we try to think and work differently. I guess. I don't think that care was separated from architecture in a certain way. I mean, I would say that as human beings, we are spatial beings. We cannot choose to not be spatial. And we also cannot choose to not care. I mean, we can care in bad ways, and we can be housed in bad ways, but there is no choice. So both of these things are, let's say, they cannot be avoided. So in that sense, when we study architecture as the existing architecture, which is more what I do because I'm not a practicing architect or designer, I would say when we look at the things that are there, we can understand how designers and architects have actually thought of the spatialization of care. And then we can see that there was something like the Fordist kitchen, or the rationalization, or so I think we can actually like go back layers and layers in a specific production that actually made impossible the things that Tatiana was speaking about. So how there is the collective kitchen, the collective act of cooking, the ways in which the organization of life was different from the organization of space through architecture with capital A. And we could say that's a territory of conflict that maybe hasn't been understood as a territory of conflict well enough by practicing architects. So I think this is one thing that I wanted to bring to the conversation. You were asking how to dismantle a system of oppression in which care will no longer be commodified. I mean, there are so many people who think that capitalism will outlast history. So I don't quite know how to answer this. I mean, I think I would love to believe that capitalism disappears. I'm not sure. I mean, if we all believe strong enough, maybe it can happen. I guess what is possible is to start organizing in one's own life, neighborhood, at the scale of influence, that is the scale of influence we can have together with others, in order to avoid as best as possible an exploitative system of caring labors. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's not per se evil to pay for care work. What is bad is the ways in which caring labors are considered dirty work, are being exploited, are rendering people exhausted and feeling undervalued. If all the people who are working as care workers were paid the amounts of money that other professions are being paid, then I think we would be in a very different situation. I'll stop here. I mean, I think we would need days, to discuss what you were raising.
I mean, for me, it really, understanding that care has been already, because it has been commodified for years now, it's scary, but on the other hand, maybe we just need to erase the word, but keep working. I now don't understand how to operate without dismantling the patriarchal system if it's not through the possibilities of care. So, and the house, for me, I mean, in what I do, because I'm an architect, encapsulates all that. So for me, it's really important to transgress this typology in the most ways possible. It's the only way to act. And hopefully that overcomes the commodification of it. No, again, if we all do it with all our hearts, maybe that is no. And and it's totally linked to la ropa sucia se lava en casa, no? Because I am in a hyper ultra privileged position and demonstrated literally physically how difficult it was to care for my family. And if I am there, I cannot understand how the 99% of the population is there. So it is really, again, a necessity to understand that privilege and not only say it, but really work again to enable other ways. No?
Thank you. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to be engaging with these narratives that you've brought from all over the world. I really appreciate it. And my first question is more focused on the intersection of care and militarization, which I think the three pieces of your work very much focus on that. So I would love to hear from the three of you on that aspect. There's currently 56 conflicts worldwide, and they're happening in 92 countries, and that considering that every international border is a separate territorial entity. And I think that shows how much of importance this context and this discourse, particularly at this moment. So my question is, how do you think we could counter-response, perhaps as architects, as designers, as anyone who sees relevance in spatial dimensions? How could we balance out and counter-response the need for security in conflict zones with this imperative that is extremely crucial to foster environments of care and compassion, especially in designs that may inadvertently reinforce militarization?
I want to add something. Feminicides happen 99.9% inside a domestic space, and they are the result of domestic violence. Yes. So the house is also a war zone and a place of conflict. Just to...
Maybe adding to that, the comment I put on the sacrifice zones from our wombs to our bodies to the indigenous land that is contaminated with this uranium radiation, or Gaza. I mean, it's a question how we... sorry, I'm having a blackout now because it's just, again, very emotional at this moment to speak about these issues. I think that conflict and?
In like militarization and conflict zones.
Well, I think if we look at the budgets, if we look at the processes, the supply chains, all the systems that are feeding into militarization, you can say, and the relationship between military invention that are done by the army and the way they are floating and moving almost seamlessly into our civic space, the way military is polluting our environment, right? And or the way civic space is being occupied through all these missions inside of cities, inside our communities. We see these huge military bases and compounds, not necessarily here, also here, but especially in the global south. I think there is so much space for us, again, to make it visible. These are spatial issues. These are issues that are related to the civic space. I was trained as an architect, but I'm looking at those spaces as part of architecture practice. It should be brought into the architecture canon because our lens into architecture is extremely limited. We are the zero, like in our schools, in our environment, we look at the 0.0001% of the built environment, while we have the capacity to engage with much broader, and not just capacity, but ethical obligation to engage with much more broader environment, which is the built environment, and see how we can use our imagination, our collective creativity to think of a better and imagine a better environment for everybody. I'll leave it at that and I'll give it to maybe Elke.
I think I want to say two very little things. So one is the word boulevard. It's actually coming from the word bulwark, which means fortification. So in a way, the ways in which cities are constructed, they have the militarization built into it. And sometimes the words are still there and meta and meaning come together, even though most people may have forgotten where the boulevard came from. But in a way, we could say the military has paved the way to urbanization on so many levels that it's really spatialized our bodies. And the other thing is that the professionalization of nurses also comes out of the Crimean war zone with Florence Nightingale, as we all know. So in a way, the deep militarization of spaces, of bodies, of health systems is perhaps tolerated to such a degree that we consider it normal, that we never even question what that does with human beings. And I think working on that to make it, I think it's a territory of invisibility, to come back to what you were saying. And as an educator and person who is trying to think about these things, I still believe that understanding them can be a first step to changing them and to maybe get this militarization of the mind and of bodies and of spaces out of our systems. But that may sound very naive. I'm still saying it.
No, absolutely. I think definitely this is the value of bringing these stories and these narratives to the school, because it allows us to see how architecture and how building in itself can be, which typically is carried with such a large notion of construction, can be rather very distractive, and the importance of planning and designing around care, and that's where the core value, I would say, is. My last question is, I also share a very similar obsession with the house, with affordable housing, particularly in my work, and I would love to talk to you about it later. But in that sense, I think I really valued what you mentioned about the house being the one thing that you work very hard for, and then it's your one economic asset, and asking us to critically interrogate what are we actually given off, and also maybe in this notion of care, what are we passing to, let's say, the next generations, being your economic asset. So in that line, I'm curious about if you could speak a little bit about the long-term impact of exclusion that we have seen of feminism and feminist voices in thinking about the house unit, but also thinking about those legal frameworks that you all showed here, which show how much exclusionary that is of a mechanism, and how could we maybe not catch up, but at least navigate that long-term impact that is there.
I mean, I see how much we are in 10 feminicides a day in Mexico. I mean, that's how much we have pushed the limits of this structure, towards a point that it has these consequences, because I totally believe if this house was based on a notion of care, it would be very different. First of all, it's not holding a nuclear structure. When we create an understanding of our sense of belonging and our interdependency in a collective, and this is how we build, it would be much more difficult. I'm not romanticizing the idea of no violence because we are all in a commune, right? But in true, if we profoundly believe on the sense of care and the interdependency with others, I would guess that there's an erasure of many forms of violence, not all of them, no, but many. And therefore, this is my obsession, no, with this. I think that there is where I can do something because I was trained as an architect to build spaces. No?
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. Do we have time for a question from the audience or one question? So, one question. If anyone has the urgency to ask one.
Who dares? No one.
Okay. I imagine we are all. Sorry? Yes.
We have one.
Thank you. So, how do you use care for, for construction, for architect as a method? So, yeah, I understand that you use care, but physically, how can we use it?
I think that requires a lecture too, or more, a seminar. There are many people working on that, right? On the relationship between, like looking at the carbon footprint and all kinds of issues that are coming from, and pollution comes from the construction industry, for instance, and trying to think how we can work with more environmentally or with materials that less harm the environment. You can look at it from that perspective, but you can also look at it from all the different perspectives that we mentioned during the lecture. So I think it's I'm happy to talk about it later, and maybe one of
I still find the John Tronto frame. John Tronto is a political theorist, and I still find her framework caring about, caring for, caregiving, care receiving, and caring with very useful. So one can use it analytically. So what does a building care about? How does it care for what it cares about? How does it actually give care? How does it need to receive care? And how does it form a collective through caring with, which Tronto calls democratic politics of care? But I think one could also use it as a design tool. So if we have these steps and we bring them together with care needs and with care provision, we can actually understand better how things that we design care for care. So I guess using these tools in order to then bring them in conversation with all the other things that architects need to pay attention to, which is money, resources, land and land rights, climate, then I think it becomes, as I said before, a tool of working. And measuring it against this can be helpful in order to not end up with sustainability measurements that only benefit the ways in which the global north measures sustainability. So I think it would be a different way of creating understanding.
I think it's very painful to finish this conversation, and at this moment, I wish we could have had more time to go deeper and continue kind of deliberating. For those who are interested, I think actually we have a workshop. We are holding a workshop, a follow-up workshop tomorrow at 11 at the Divinity School. So for those who registered, we are looking forward to continue this conversation with you, and we will continue in other places. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.